prepare them to be in for the long haul as we're trying to provide good care to patients and families and clients that we're seeing, and but also just taking good care of ourselves first. So some of the conversations we're having, I thought, most people aren't having the privilege of being able to hear these brilliant minds from all over the country. So wanted to give you kind of some updates about some of the stuff that we're seeing. First of all, it's like there's a poor connection. Oh, now I'm back. One of the things that's really real that I've been telling folks to prepare for, and not everybody was quite clear about this. I want to say a bit more about it to help. If we name it and know what it is, then it'll catch us less off guard. We'll be more prepared to handle it, whatever happens. So one thing that happens when there's a crisis is in the initial stage, there's this initial rush of adrenaline. People pull together. There's this excitement and energy around it. People show up. We're cheering healthcare workers. We're delivering things. We're helping out neighbors. We're doing sidewalk chalk drawings. We're holding up signs. There are all these things that happen when there's a crisis in the initial stages. You may remember after 9/11, there was this huge groundswell of energy where people came together, and this feel-good energy of unity. We're in this together. We have each other's backs. We're going to make this. It can feel really good, even in the midst of the crazy times and the challenging times we're facing. But there's this other thing that happens. After that initial excitement, and I feel a little weird using that word, but it's literally what happens in our bodies. There's an adrenal excitement from that rush, from the trauma response that goes on in our bodies to prepare us to be able to fight, flight, freeze, etc. That our bodies can register as much as it can be about anxiety. There's also this huge energy. Like when I was a kid and the volunteer fire department sirens would be running as Floyd Blankenship and others would be going down our Farm to Market Road out where we lived out in Redwater, Texas. And it would mean that somewhere there was probably some neighbor down the road was having either their barn or their pasture or even their house was on fire. And as weird as it may seem, although some of you I know have lived this, there would be this, all right, kids, let's go get up in the car. We'd load up in the car and we'd drive down the road and follow the volunteer fire department trucks and go see whose house was on fire. It was partly a thing of solidarity. It was partly a thing that you just did. You showed up. But there was this excitement and energy about it, even though it was something traumatic. And so at the beginning of this, a lot of folks, even though we are a little ashamed to admit it, at the beginning of this, there was this feeling of almost like, woohoo, it's an extended Christmas holiday vacation or summer break or spring break. As much as it's traumatic, there was also this feeling of relief about not having to suit up and show up and wear real pants. I know that's not been the case for people who are home alone taking care of a loved one without support now, that support can't come in, or if they're really isolated and can't get access to people like some of us can through social media and other ways. And people who are home trying to work and care for and homeschool their kids without wrapping them up in duct tape and hanging them from the ceiling fan. So we know that it can be really challenging for many folks. So I don't mean to minimize that, but there is this initial excitement that comes up and that unity and that feel-good feeling. But that can't last forever. There comes a point in the midst of a crisis when that peak of energy hits. We get past the initial stage and phase of things, and that excitement starts to wear off, and the threat response system that's gone on in our bodies, our system gets to a point where it can't handle it anymore. It's on overload, and we get crisis fatigue. And so what was this feel-good, rah-rah, yay, we're going to pull together, turns into this thing where we turn on each other. I was talking to a neighbor earlier when I was walking my dog, and she used to work with volunteer services at the university here in Texas, University of Texas. Sorry, Aggie friends, I didn't mean to say the University in Texas, at University of Texas. And but she used to work with volunteer services, and she said, we'd see the same thing where there would come this point when, after going out and working with people who had gone through natural disasters, or when helping people build houses, or whatever was going on, whatever recovery efforts the students were going out and volunteering their time to go do, for most of the trip they would all be in that place of unity. But she said, what you're describing of this fatigue where people turn on each other at a certain point, towards the end of the week, they would start grousing and griping and would be at each other's throats. And she said, so that's exactly what was going on. They were fatigued from having spent the week giving, and pulling together, seeing traumatic things and people struggling, and they reached their limits, and it wasn't fun and excited anymore, and they turned on each other. I've been warning folks to get ready, because there was going to come a point when the feel-good stuff that we were seeing and that we were doing with each other would start to fade and would shift to angst and frustration, and our trauma responses and our fears and anxiety and uncertainty would start to turn to grousing and griping and snarking at each other. And it's happening. We've seen it in the last week. We've seen it increasingly on social media and the protest. And it's also sinking in the reality that this may be something we need to settle in for the long haul. So what I want to say is, don't let it scare you. If you find yourself feeling more irritable and snarky, of course you are. If people around you have gone from woohoo, feel good, we're in this together, unity, to grousing and snarking and saying and doing things that don't match up with who you know them to be, it's trauma. It's our exhaustion from being with the trauma. It's not fun anymore. It doesn't feel like an extended vacation or holiday break anymore. Shit's getting real. And we're now that much more anxious. We're not sure how we're going to keep making it. We're worried about our loved ones. So just know that if you're seeing this happening, just breathe. Find as much compassion as you can for yourself and for people around you. Feel free to name it. If you in your family are starting to get snarky with each other, on your teams, if you're finding yourselves turning on each other. I had a student last night contact me because kind of really struggling because that feel good. We're going to be vulnerable. We're going to work hard like family and pull together in this unit where they are caring for COVID positive patients in an ICU, 30-bed ICU. So they've been pulling together in incredible ways as a team to take care of these 30 patients on vents and drips and working to care for them and try to save lives. And it's been gorgeous the last few weeks. But I've been naming there will come a point when people start to implode on each other. And it happened yesterday. A nurse broke protocol and some things happened and they all turned on each other. And it was horrible. So debriefing with that student and trying to work with her and support her. Clients I've been working with this week, leadership trying to find their way through the same thing. So if you find that the feel-goods have eased off, don't worry, it's not you. You're not crazy. You're not bad. It's not the end of the world. Just breathe. Name that, guys, we're worn out and we've got some fatigue going on. Let's go to neutral corners, relax, breathe. Name that this is hard and we're overwhelmed, and then come back and let's hit the reset button and say, now, how are we going to settle in for what clearly is going to be a marathon and not a sprint? Want to name too a few things, and I didn't start a timer, so I'm probably going to go way over the 5 minutes I'd planned to make this far, but I think it's important to name these things. Grief is when we are struggling with loss, and everyone is experiencing grief right now. There are things that we don't have access to, that we can't have access to. There's also anticipatory grief, where we know that we've faced the risk of loss, or at some point we're going to be losing things, everything from activities, connections, jobs. We have concerns for people that we love, and so there's grief that's very real that's happening. There also is trauma. It's traumatic when we face a perceived threat and we don't feel like we can do anything about it. So most of us are facing some form of trauma in the midst of this right now because it's just scary, and that's primary trauma. Secondary and vicarious trauma are when we're not directly experiencing it, but we're seeing someone else who is. If you're like many of us, we're constantly scrolling social media and the media, and we're hearing all the stories, the feel-good ones and the hard ones. So we're seeing other people going through this. The people that I work with, the frontline workers, they're seeing this every day. They're in the hospitals having to tell family members, we're sorry, we know your loved one is dying, but you can't come back here. And so there's the secondary and vicarious trauma of watching other people go through and face a threat, or even not succumb to it. That sounds like they've given in. Be actually taken out by a threat, physically or emotionally or spiritually. We also know that in addition to primary trauma and secondary and vicarious trauma, that there's moral distress. Moral distress is when I know what to do, but I'm constrained from being able to do it. So we're seeing this in the staff members, chaplains, and social workers who've been deemed not essential. And that's been a hard blow for a lot of them, struggling with, why am I not essential? People are dying, people are hurting and grieving, and I'm not allowed to come in and be with them. Well, yeah, because it's not ethical, it's not wise, it's not helpful if we're going to go in and then become a carrier and bring the disease, bring the virus out to others. And so, as much as it breaks our hearts, where there are ways that we're not able to provide the care that we know to care. Even nurses and physicians and others caregivers of various sorts, teachers and others, we know how to be a good insert role here. But it's hard to be the teacher that you know to be when you're working on Zoom. It's hard to be the nurse that you know to be when you're in crisis mode and you're having to triage and you don't have time to take the time that you know that you normally would. It is hard to be a mental health practitioner. My therapist friends are struggling because they are hour after hour after hour hearing people that are so activated in the midst of their anxiety and being so traumatized by what we're living through right now that it's just taking them out, and it's hard for them to provide the care that they know to give because the need is so extensive and pervasive and everyone is wrestling with it. So beyond moral distress, then there's the moral injury that happens when we are doing things that go against everything we've been trained to do and everything that we know to do as humans. Moral injury happens when we do something that goes against our deeply held morals and beliefs, or we see other people take actions that go against our deepest held morals and beliefs. We usually speak about this with veterans who've served in armed forces. We say don't kill, but then we put a gun in their hands and say don't kill, it's for the greater good. And so they're doing what they believe is right to protect people, and yet it goes against everything else they know to do. So for a physician to say, I'm sorry, I know your loved one is ill, but you can't be with them. Or for a facility administrator, a healthcare facility like a skilled nursing facility or independent living facility or memory care facility, to look at family members and say, we're sorry, we know you want to come see your loved one. We know that they're declining. We know that your time with them is precious as their dementia is progressing. But we can't risk, for the greater good, letting you in to be with them right now. So being the person who time and time again is having to put someone in that situation, is having to hold that boundary and that line, that goes against everything we know to do as a professional and as a human being. And so example after example of this, that we're experiencing moral injury because it's an existential threat, because everything that we know about being a human being says that's just not the way that we work. So if there's pre-existing trauma or pre-existing grief that is still in the process of healing, we know that that can get triggered and re-triggered, and we can get re-traumatized by the things that we're experiencing. So I don't need to elaborate on this anymore. We know it and we're living it. But here's what I wanted to say about all that. Sometimes it's helpful to have someone name what you're feeling and experiencing. And we're also seeing moral distress and moral injury, moral distress especially from team members like nurses who are retired, or physicians who work in academia, or people like me, chaplains and grief counselors and trauma counselors who are working more as a consultant in a consultant capacity or training capacity, but can't travel and be on site with people like we normally are to hold space with them. And so we're getting to get creative and find other ways, but it's still really hard to want to be there and to feel guilty because we can't right now and we aren't sure what to do. So that's why I've been trying to find ways to post and say, what are the things that we can do? Let's take resilience and break it down into practical terms. So the things that I teach about resilience are the ways that we can get through this time, not just surviving, but actually thriving through so that we're better on the other side of this. It's called post-traumatic growth in some instances, and I think that definitely applies here. So what I first want you to hear is if you are feeling exhausted, even though your butt hasn't left the couch and all you've done is eat cookie dough straight from the tube with a spoon and or even just your fingers while you binge watch Tiger King, so you haven't done a dadgum thing but you are exhausted, you are not a slacker. There is nothing wrong with you. What's going on is that when we're going on during peaceful regular times, our brains consume a significant chunk of our body's resources and energy: blood, oxygen, resources, nutrients. And so our brains use a lot of energy to do all the functions it needs to do as one big old organ, just like any of the other parts of our bodies do, our muscles, our tissues, etc. The other thing that happens is that when we are going through times of stress and trauma, like right now, our brains are trying to make sense out of what the heck is going on. When we're grieving, we're wrestling with trauma. When we're going through crises like we are right now, our brains need a story that makes sense. We're trying to make sense out of all this. And so as we're trying to cope and trying to process, our brains go from using in the 30%, 35% to 40% of our body's resources, and it jacks up to using in the upper 80% to lower 90% of our body's resources. So that's why if we're grieving and we've done nothing but sit on the couch, but we feel like we've run a marathon, it's because our bodies have done the equivalent of running a marathon, because our brains have used all of those nutrients and the oxygen and all the things running through our system that we take in the fuel from eating and process it, and our bodies use it in the ways that it needs to. Sorry for moving, I didn't put this on a stand. And so if we're exhausted, it's because our brains are sucking all of the energy out of all the rest of our body to do what it needs to do to try to make sense of things. So when we're tired and we're stressed and we're trying to cope, if we're exhausted, it's for good reason. It's the body's way of taking care of us and giving all the resources to our brain so our brain can do the work that it needs to do. If you are feeling anxious, if you are feeling snarky, if you are feeling scared and out of sorts, there's nothing wrong with you. You're not alone. You're not crazy. Your body's doing what it needs to do, trying to make sense of things. People are also when we're traumatized, when we're grieving, when we're struggling, we're so preoccupied, we don't have a good spatial sense or good sense of our bodies. And so people will be more likely to have accidents. We'll step off a curb wrong because we just don't notice it. We'll walk into things, we'll trip and fall. There will be more car wrecks. Was just hearing from a friend earlier who got sideswiped by someone who ran a red light, and he swore he just didn't even see the red light. And I believe him. We're traumatized. We're not thinking clearly. So be that much more careful and aware. Be that much more mindful of what's going on around you and in your body. And so if you're noticing these things, snark amongst the teams that you're part of, frustration and stress, exhaustion, anxiety, irritability, just know that there ain't nothing wrong with you. We're dealing with a hella hard time. And so resilience, I can share in another post sometime later. I don't want to overwhelm with too much information right now. And yeah, I know I've gone way over the 5 minutes, so I'll get to retitle this later. But just know that in short, resilience is about the way that we mind the stories that we're telling ourselves. So it's about perceptions and meaning making. It's also about locus of control, whether we internalize our locus of control and focus on the things that we can do. Despite all the things that we can't, what are the things that we can do? That's why even though the protective quality of cloth masks is really circumspect, they don't really block out the viruses very much. They're of minimal help. And yet when I tried to name that early on, when people were going crazy sewing masks out the wazoo, I got so much pushback, even from my friends in healthcare. And one of them said, even if it just blocks out 3% of the virus. And I said, I get it. You need to feel like you're doing something. And so I backed off. People felt like they needed to do something. And it does provide a little bit of help. It is better than nothing. But we need to feel like we're doing something. And so instead of focusing on the things that we can't do, focus on the things that we can. It doesn't mean that we deny and pretend that the things that we can't do aren't real. They're real. We get to grieve them. We get to name them and be honest about them and get support and go, this sucks. And have people go, yeah, it does. But the thing is, we don't want to get stuck there. if we get stuck hyper-focusing on what we can't do, then there's nothing helpful and resilient about that. And so we focus on after we name and acknowledge and get validation for the things we can't do and give ourselves space to grieve it, then we take a deep breath and go, okay, now what are the things that we can do? Let's focus on those. It's also not just about that internalized locus of control and focusing on what we can control and letting go of what we can't, rather than externalizing our locus of control and making it everybody else's fault and everybody else's responsibility. It's also about where we are able to be more adaptive, creative in our coping and ways of being flexible. And so as we work on doing that, we're definitely getting more creative right now with trying to find different ways to provide help and support to people. But creativity requires, by definition, it requires safety, because creativity involves risk. We have to know that if we take a risk and it doesn't go well, that people will catch us, we won't totally fall, and that we won't get shamed and judged and thrown under the bus if it doesn't work well. And so in order to be adaptive and flexible and creative, we really need to provide safe spaces for and with each other, where we can be heard, be seen, be loved on, and then have someone somewhere in the conversation has to then say, all right, given this reality, how are we going to respond constructively to take care of ourselves and to come out better on the other side of this? And so that's one of the things that we can do. It's also about self-care, it's not just some fuzzy woo-woo good idea concept. It is our greatest clinical competence. I was on with a meeting last night speaking about this stuff to a group of APRNs, advanced care nurses and nurse practitioners. And when I said this, that in a time of crisis, more than ever, we feel like we can't take care of ourselves. And already, those of us in caregiving, we come in with at least a little bit or a lot of our own codependence. That's usually often what drives us, is out of our own brokenness. We then want to come and be helpful for others, and there's nothing wrong with that. It can give us some of our greatest superhuman skills as caregivers. The trick is just to notice and monitor it, so we use the best of those skills rather than letting them become our Achilles heel that wipes us out. And so we have to practice good boundaries, and we have to practice good self-care. And so when I said during a time of crisis, now more than ever, it's when it's important for us to be practicing our own self-care. And the whole meeting stopped as this group of well-educated, smart people went, wait, you mean we have permission to do our own self-care? I said, no, not just permission. I'm giving it to you as a charge. You must. You can have all the best clinical tools in your toolbox, the best mnemonics, the best technical skills as a caregiver. But at the end of the day, if you're not grounded and centered because you've been doing your self-care, if you're not grounded and centered and able to wield those tools well, you'll be ineffective at least and dangerous at worst. And none of us got into this field to be dangerous. So we must take care of ourselves so that we can show up well for others. There's nothing selfish about it. It's actually the most loving thing we can do to take care of ourselves so that we can be in a better place for others. And then lastly, there's one other thing. That's also about community. So it's about perceptions and meaning making. It's about locus of control. It is about adaptivity and flexibility and coping, which requires safety. It's about self-care, which involves boundaries and taking care of ourselves without feeling guilty. There's nothing selfish about self-care. Selfish is when I do something for me at your expense. Self-care is when I take good care of me so that I can show up well for you. And then it's also about community and connection and feeling like we have people who will not throw us under the bus and who have our backs. All of my income just about went away over the course of about 19 hours on around, it was March 13th when we started realizing how bad things were. And so my trips and conferences started getting canceled left and right. I'm not sure financially what's going to happen. I'm writing, I'm putting together webinars and content, I'm working on courses and things to put out there. I'll probably try to do a Patreon campaign when I can get that together. But, at the end of the day, here's the thing. I'm not going to, right now, I'm sheltered, I'm fed, I'm safe, I'm surrounded, I have options to take action on my own behalf. But here's the kicker. I have people around me who will always have my back. That's a luxury. That's a privilege that not everybody has, that kind of a social safety net. Even if I go bankrupt and the dog and I wind up on a friend's couch, it will not change that I will be sheltered and I will be fed and I'll be safe and I'll be cared for. And bankruptcy eventually goes away, and but it's probably not going to happen. I always find ways to pay my bills. I always have and always will. But just know that it helps to know that we have community and connection and people around us who have our backs and won't let us fall. And that leads into the next point, because it's also about gratitude and hope. We think of gratitude and hope as feelings, and they're not. I can feel grateful, but I must practice gratitude as a discipline in order to remember to be grateful. I can feel hopeful, but I build hope by practicing it. And I do that by facing challenging circumstances, having people around me who believe in my ability to find my way through. And then once I do, I have built hope so that I know that the next time I face a challenging circumstance, I'll be able to face it because I already have. And so that's how we build hope. We don't have to give people hope. In fact, we can't. We help them build it by showing up and being present with them and saying, while you face this hella hard time, you don't have to face it alone. I'm with you. And I believe in your ability to find your way through. You've got this. That's how we help people build hope. And so that involves that space of community and being surrounded by people who you know will always have your back. So as scary and hard as it is, I actually feel pretty peaceful because I know that I have people who love me and will always have my back and will never let me fall and will never want me to feel shame or anything but good and loved and cared for and hopeful and empowered and equipped to do good in the world like I try to do. And so that piece of gratitude, that's where we focus on those things. So when I'm talking to my mentor and I get pissy and I'm struggling and she'll say, have you done a gratitude list? Well, no. Well, go do a gratitude list and call me back when you have. Our brains hyper-focus on the negative, and it's adaptive. We need to know where the fence is knocked down. That means that the saber-toothed tiger can come in and eat us. So we need to focus on where things are wrong. We need to be able to see the negative. In caregiving and healthcare especially, we're constantly looking for the negative. We're diagnosing what's wrong, what's wrong, what needs to be fixed. And so we do that. It's adaptive. It's a good thing. And we're so good at it. Our brains are so good at this that we have to retrain our brains to also notice what is good. And so we have to be intentional about practices of gratitude, because if not, we'll get so stuck in the negative of the story that we'll forget to notice the rest. When I first was working with my mentor, she would say, I would tell her what was going on. I'd be grousing and complaining and griping. And she said, and he did, and they did. And she'd say, I hear you. Yeah, I hear you. And then finally, when I'd kind of just, hit the decompression valve, there'd come a point where she would say, now, tell me the rest of the story. What do you mean? That's the whole story. He said this, and she said that, and I did this, and then we're going to, no, you tell me all that. But now tell me the rest of the story. This went on for a while until I finally said, I clearly don't know what the heck you're talking about. What do you mean the rest of the story? That's the whole story. She's like, no, you've told me this part of the story. These things that are seemingly bad. And I believe you. Those are true. But these things are also true. You are strong and you are capable and you're smart and you're able to take action on your own behalf. You may be powerless to change people and circumstances, but you're not helpless to take action on your own behalf. That means that you are at choice. You are not a victim here. You can choose how you engage. You have people around you who will always have your back and who love you. And she's my spiritual mentor, so she can say, you have a God who loves you and has a greater imagination than you do and can help make a way out of no way. And so because I love you, because I believe in you, I believe that you can set boundaries, ask for what you need, get creative, challenge the stories in your head that are less helpful than others. The rest of the story is also true. And so I teach people to finish the circle. So we can vent and decompress, but there comes a point when we need to say, all right, these are things that we can't change. But given this set of circumstances, what's the rest of the story? How can we finish the circle? What are the things that we can change and make different and do something about? What are the things, where can we take action on our own behalf to be constructive in the way that we show up rather than adding to the dysfunction and the angst and the fear and the anxiety by the ways that we respond. So, yeah, way more than my 5 minutes. I'll go back and title this more later. I was just going to share a few notes about this idea of crisis fatigue because I've seen people experiencing it and then feeling badly about it or feeling sad. I've been feeling sad about seeing the way people have been snarking with each other. And so I just thought, let me just name it so that people know, because not everybody's had access to, this kind of stuff. This is the area I live in. Trauma, grief, yeah. This is what I do. So I'll be sharing more of these from time to time. I hopefully won't make them quite as long. I got on a roll because I wanted you guys to have access to this stuff. But trauma, grief, resilience, how we take care of ourselves. There are some quick and easy techniques that I can teach people. I'm just going to start taking the stuff that I teach all over the place and try to start bringing it to y'all and give you access to it, because this is hard. It's scary. And we've got this. We can do this. And we don't have to do it alone. So, whatever you're facing, whatever you're experiencing, please be easy and gentle with yourself. Please know that you're not alone. You're not crazy. You're not a slacker. You're not weak. You're a human being having an incredibly normal reaction to very abnormal circumstances. But the good news is we can come through this. We can do this. And we can be better on the other side. We may not have cleaned out our closets. We may not have six-pack abs. We may not have learned a new language. But we can find new ways of being present with each other without judgment, without needing to shut it down, without needing to fix it, without shame, but just to be with each other and go, yeah, this sucks. And I'm sorry it's so hard. But there's nothing wrong with you. And you're not alone. And I believe in your ability to find your way through. So, for what it's worth, hope it's helpful, you guys. Share this if you like. I'm in my cycling clothes. I'm about to go for a bike ride. So, yeah, I wasn't planning on doing a big old shebang. Was just going to do a few minutes of something. So, yeah, we'll see. Neon yellow, probably not the greatest thing to be on the screen with. It's probably not easy on the eyes. But take care of yourselves, and I'll do more soon. If there's a topic in particular around all this that you want to hear more about, reach out to me and let me know, because we got to know this stuff, and we can learn and get better. All right, I'm stopping. Y'all take care. Much love to y'all. Peace. Keep breathing. We got it.